Hello and welcome to Media News. Media News aims to be an authentic voice bringing you the real truthful stories from the Middle East with a particular focus on the Kurdish question that is often ignored, self-censored or suppressed by the mainstream media platforms. In today's edition, we will be exploring the issues surrounding the UK's criminalisation of the Kurds as they face an existential struggle for survival in the Middle East against a full-scale political and military onslaught from the Turkish state. Since the establishment of the modern state of Turkey in 1923 out of the ashes of the Ottoman Empire, the newly formed Turkish state abandoned any idea of granting the sizable population of Kurdish people living within the borders of the newly defined Turkish state, mostly in the southeast, autonomy or rights of self-determination, as was stipulated and required in the terms of the Treaty of Sèvres, signed just 3 years before. Now, after the Treaty of Lausanne in 1923, establishing the borders of Turkey, Kurds were denied not just their rights of self-determination, but the newly formed Kemalist government now announced that any non-Turkish citizen of Turkey would be forcibly Turkified. İsmet İnönü, one of the founders of the Turkish state, speaking at the Turkish Congress of the Turk Ocağı in 1925, said, "We are frankly nationalist, and nationalism is our only factor of cohesion. Before the Turkish majority, other elements have no kind of influence. At any price, we must Turkify the inhabitants of our land, and we will annihilate those who oppose Turks or Turkism." With this chilling statement of intent, the Turkish state began a forced assimilation policy against the Kurdish people, who it is estimated make up to anything between a quarter to a third of the population of Turkey. What followed were massacres on genocidal scales, as the Turkish state labelled any Kurd who refused to abide by this new policy and forcibly assimilate to be a Turk, giving up their ancient language, culture and history, as terrorists. And Kurdish leaders were hung and exiled while villages were burned and millions of Kurds forced into exile. This has essentially been the Turkish state's policy ever since. And today, Turkey are still destroying towns, bombing villages, criminalizing elected Kurdish politicians and mayors, and still attempting to forcibly assimilate the Kurds against their will to be Turks, and still labeling any Kurds who do not submit to their will as terrorists. The list of crimes that Turkey has been found guilty of at the European Court of Human Rights is very long, and the United Nations and the European Parliament have both condemned Turkey for its war crimes perpetrated against the Kurds. However, while this policy of framing the Kurdish issue from an angle of security, requiring only a military and repressive solution, has clearly failed, even from a Turkish perspective, leaving the Kurdish people's identity and struggle for basic rights stronger after nearly 100 years of repression and an enormous human cost. What is also clear is that the Turkish state is running out of ideas and options, and that a peaceful and political solution has never been more urgently needed for the Kurdish question, to bring peace and stability, not just to Turkey, but to Syria, Iraq, and the wider region in the Middle East. However, successive British governments, despite knowing full well the crimes committed against the Kurds by the Turkish state, have supported Turkey's failed strategy of continuing to label the Kurd struggle for basic rights and justice as terrorism, blocking all avenues or possibilities for a political, peaceful settlement of this long-running issue that has caused so much human suffering on both sides. So, to find out to what extent the UK is complicit in the repression of the Kurds, and to discuss the issues surrounding this support given by the UK government to Turkey, we're joined, very pleased and honoured to be joined today by Alastair Lyon from the law firm Bernberg Pierce. Alastair is probably one of the leading experts in this field in the UK, having dealt with dozens of legal cases that have involved the British government attempting to criminalise Kurds on behalf of the Turkish state. Alastair has been a solicitor at Bernberg Pierce, a company known, very famous for its human rights work and its work on challenging the British government's anti-terror laws. He has been a solicitor at Bernberg Pierce for 25 years, specialising in criminal defence with a very strong human rights component. Welcome to Media News, Alastair.
Thank you for asking me.
So, Alastair, I mean, you have had such an enormous experience of working on dozens of cases. I mean, I know, but people who are listening to this program may not know the extent that the UK government has been colluding with Turkey in regards to criminalising the Kurdish community in the UK. Do you think you could just give us a little bit of a history and a little bit of and describe some of the things that the British government have been doing?
Certainly. I mean, as you said, my experience as a solicitor goes back about 25 years, which is fairly close on for when, certainly from a clear legal perspective, one can identify the shifting ground and British government policy. I'm perhaps not best qualified to talk about the 70s and 80s and to some extent the 90s, but certainly from the arrival of the Terrorism Act 2000 and thereafter, one can see a clear political decision that was taken by this government within its, it was a foreign policy decision masquerading as a criminal justice decision. When the Terrorism Act 2000 was introduced, as one of the components of this act was a list of terrorist organizations. There was a list of literally dozens. Now, one can argue separately and philosophically or politically about what use the word terrorism is in a debate in any event, but some may perhaps have been more comprehensible, at least to the average person. Many were not. Yet there was no separate discussion as to, within Parliament, or indeed very little without Parliament, as to the appropriateness of any of these organisations. It was presented to Parliament on a take and leave it basis. So in consequence, the PKK at that point were placed on the list. As I say, this was a matter of political choice. It wasn't obvious at that time, and certainly even less obvious since, that they would even fit certainly within a popular understanding of a terrorist organisation. I mean, many would say, in fact, perhaps most sensible organisations say it clearly isn't. However, there was no parliamentary debate about it. And in consequences, that set a chain of legal reactions, providing the state with ever-increasing powers to deal with any Kurdish, what may in other contexts would be called dissidents, or perhaps just Kurds with a sense of their own identity organising in the UK, because it became very easy to describe them as terrorists. This has happened, in the last 20 or 25 years in different ways. Once you are described, or an organisation is described as a terrorist organisation, when you travel in and out of the country, under part of the Terrorism Act, Schedule 7 of the Terrorism Act, there is then a power to be detained. And it used to be up to 9 hours, it's now up to 6 hours. And as importantly, as part of the detention, when they can ask you questions about why you're coming into the country or leaving it, they can take your phone and they can look at all your contacts and they can look at all your messages. And in the modern world, we know that the huge access to someone's life that gives. And they can do it without justification, but they do not even need reasonable suspicion once you're in the terrorist box. So in other words, any Kurdish activist, it is a very small jump to say any Kurdish activist must have a connection with the PKK, must have a connection with terrorism, and therefore there is a right to stop back, the whole of the Kurdish community as it travels. And they have used that, and they have used that on many, many occasions against people completely lawfully and for lawful reasons coming in and out of the country. They can use it to get warrants to search people's houses. They can use it if they're political demonstrations to arrest people. They can use it, as they have several times in the last few years, to accuse community centres of supporting terrorism if they have any political aspect to them at all. most recently, and most extraordinarily, they can use them to arrest and put people on trial for terrorism in relation to events of supporting groups such as the YPG in Syria, who have never been actually put on a terrorism list, but they prosecuted and tried to prosecute on the basis of connections of individuals having connections to the PKK. Perhaps most significantly, however, in my view at least, is although of course each of these intrusions is disastrous for the individuals involved, is a chilling effect it's given to the Kurdish community in Britain. It's told it is, like the Irish before, a suspect community. It is a terrorist community. Those there wishing to exercise their undoubtedly inalienable rights to express themselves politically are told you cannot express yourself in the way you might wish, because we have decided, the British state, that in doing so you are supporting terrorism. So undoubtedly, the British state has taken a view. It has taken a position on the Kurdish struggle, and it has sided with Turkey. So that's a brief headline summary of the ways in which the people have been impacted in this country.
Okay, thanks for that. So, I mean, just listening to that sort of description reminds me very much of what is happening to the Kurds in Turkey. I mean, Kurds are being sort of brushed with this very generalized, not just even Kurds. So recently, some of the opposition parties, CHP, were brushed with this, this label of terrorism. This word is just used so liberally by everybody, it seems to shut down any kind of discussion about the Kurdish issue, and therefore any possibility of a peaceful political settlement to the Kurdish issue. Can you just give us a flavor of the sort of things that are happening to the Kurdish community because of these anti-terror laws?
Well, I mean, by way of example, there have been in recent years 2 community centres where warrants have been issued under the Terrorism Act and executed by terrorist officers in relation to what's said to be either fraud or fundraising for terrorism, which have had no basis whatsoever. Now, of course, it's very targeted. A community centre is is a very important focal point of a community, perhaps by definition. And the raids not only serve to send a message to a community saying do not organise us within this centre, they also take information, and the information that is taken is often about community centres are a broad hub of support for people. People come for advice about all sorts of issues, and they lose their trust, and they can lose their trust within the community, within that centre, as to whether it is a safe place to be at all. And that's quite shocking, particularly because community centres always grow up and financed by the community, because there is a very real need for spaces that people feel able to express themselves, talk about sensitive issues, not just political ones, but often not political ones. And the moment that trust is broken, it's not just broken within the community; it's between the community and the British state, and that's a very, very serious issue. Separately, when people feel that if they're travelling in and out of the country, that they're going to be targeted because of their identity as Kurds, that's equally shocking, and it happens on regular occasions. And as I say, the chilling effect of it is even for all those who aren't stopped but fear they might, each time they're thinking of leaving the country, they're fearful of the consequences, and they have done nothing wrong. I should say that whilst it is absolutely not to underplay the seriousness of the situation, my real problem, or from a non-Kurdish, I won't say independent, I wouldn't claim to be truly independent, but is the sheer hypocrisy of it all, because it is undoubtedly there. The law is the PKK have been prescribed, and the laws used when it suits against others, not for criminal justice reasons, not because this country or this government truly believes that the Kurds are terrorists, because it suits them for realpolitik, for their relations with Turkey. I say that because if they truly believed the Kurdish community here was essentially a terrorist community, was a community that was dedicated to the use of unlawful violence, was the killing of civilians, and they know it's not. They would behave in an entirely different way. The powers they have are extraordinary. They could do much, much more than they do. And again, that's not to minimise the terrible things that they do, but they don't. Which for me is a sign of the politics behind this. It's nothing to do with law. It's to do with the politicisation of law. We know, when one looks at, for example, measures that were taken in relation to ISIS and arrests and all of that in this country, it's completely different. So on one hand, it's depressing because it shows the unnecessary nature. On the other hand, and perhaps if I can be positive, it shows that there is perhaps some recognition within the British state of the reality. I mean, they're hiding it rather well. But if I'm wanting to move forward and to try and get the British state to move forward, it's a starting point.
So yes, Alastair, that's a really interesting point that you made just there. I mean, over the 30 years that I've been involved, I've seen all these cases and all this harassment of the Kurdish community in London and elsewhere around the UK. I mean, really quite nasty, sort of insidious sort of repression. I mean, a friend of mine who just sold newspapers, the Kurdish newspaper Özgür Politika, and she distributed it and collected the money to send back to the publisher. And she had like anti-terrorist police breaking down her door, children on the floor. And these are quite, the interpretation of this anti-terror law that labels the Kurds as terrorists is incredibly traumatizing for the community. But as you say, there have been hardly any cases over the years. Have there in actual fact been any cases?
I'm aware of one. Many years ago, there was a prosecution. In fact, a colleague of mine was involved in the defence, but as I was in a minor way. But there was a fundraising prosecution which collapsed. I'm aware of been arrests for fundraising, but no charges in circumstances where I would have expected charges, not because the people were guilty, but because of the interpretation of the evidence. Perhaps most remarkably of all is where there have been criminal cases and have been in relation to the YPG.
The Shilan Özçelik case I'm thinking of there.
Yeah, and well, there have been those who've been, for example, Jim Matthews, who I represented, who was a British soldier who was with the YPG openly, documentary from 2015 to 2016, who was bailed for 2 years, then prosecuted. On the basis, in fact, not so much that he was fighting the YPG, although that was there, but also he'd attended a terrorist training camp, which they thought was some clever way of getting a prosecution going without dealing with the legality or otherwise of the YPG. What was interesting about that case and a subsequent other one was when they were asked to justify this, when they were asked to give up all the information about the extent to which the YPG was at the very least working with the allied, the coalition forces, and in relation to anything to do with the Turkish government and the British government, as to what extent the Turkish government had been putting pressure for prosecution. They dropped the case, as they did with subsequent cases. But to my knowledge, the 2 or 3 YPG prosecutions or similar, plus the fundraising, are the only ones in the last 20 years in terms of criminal cases, which is why I say the whole thing reeks of hypocrisy. Because if the PKK were a truly terrorist organisation and were believed to be so, And undoubtedly, there are large numbers of Kurds in this country. It would be unsurprising if some of them were, were doing their best to support that organisation. Why are they not being prosecuted? And the answer is because they know it's rubbish. They know it's rubbish. This is the criminal justice system being used to settle politics. It undoubtedly assists the British state if on occasion someone gets arrested or someone gets raided. It undoubtedly assists them if they stop people, at the borders, or if they raid people for selling lawful newspapers. It undoubtedly assists their discussions with Turkey, but it's not principled. Has nothing to do with terrorism. And as we talked about earlier, the effect on the community is they don't know, nobody knows whether this is going to be the time that things do go further, or if they're threatened at the border with difficulties coming back the next time or whatever. It's very, very real for people.
Yeah, it's completely traumatic. I mean, another friend of mine who just happened to pick up a flag one day on a demonstration and was sort of snatched by a squad of very aggressive police officers, and months later he had to appear in court under terrorism charges. I don't know whether you were involved in that case, were you?
Well, I mean, interestingly, I am involved in it. There's an issue in relation to, we're going to the Supreme Court in about 2 months actually on the Terrorism Act. There's a challenge to the Terrorism Act as a result of all of that. So that with any luck there may be some justice, but we'll as far as they're concerned.
Okay, so it's clear then that the British government, although they use these repressive laws to bully and intimidate the Kurdish community on behalf of the Turkish state who are carrying out this war against the Kurds, it's clear that it would be rather embarrassing if all these facts came out in court. Is that what you're saying?
What we know is in relation to the criminal cases where you have the greatest ability to request stuff from the state. So there's a disclosure exercise in which you can say, we believe this prosecution is an abuse of the process of court, for example. We don't think this is an honourable, proper prosecution for the right reasons. One of the reasons we believe this is as follows, and in the most recent one I dealt with, which was the father of a YPG volunteer who had sent money. We said, we want to know, and we said, maybe he has sent money, but it was to prevent war crimes in relation to Afrin and the unlawful Turkish invasion. What on earth are you doing prosecuting someone when you know that they're acting in response to war crimes, and prohibited behaviour? We want all the information that connects your prosecution with knowledge about the legality of the Turkish state, etc. And at that point, they put up the white flag. Now, I can't speculate. Who knows? Maybe there was some other reason. We attempted to try and get them to formally concede the grounds in which they were withdrawing the case, but they refused to do so. They refused to admit why they were dropping it. But it's hard to think there wasn't a connection at that stage of the disclosure requests. So again, the criminal justice system is protecting the politics rather than being independent of it.
It's really extraordinary, for a layperson to try and get your head around this. So basically what we're saying here is that a law is being used against and oppressed people purely for political and presumably economic relations with the country who is brutally repressing those very same people. So, Alastair, if you would mind just briefly touching on the Belgium court case, because as an all-party parliamentary group report that was recently published by a group in the British Parliament led by Lloyd Russell Moyle, they have suggested that really this label of terrorism has never actually been proved in any legal case, and this was actually proved, wasn't it, by the Belgium court case, which for the first time all the issues were actually raised in court, and the case was thrown out, and obviously, it was recognized that the PKK were not a terrorist organization legally. Could you tell us a little bit more about that?
Well, yeah, the Belgian court was very interesting because of the tenacity of the lawyers who did a wonderful job, and the willingness of the court to consider the legal position in its true context. Basically, what has been forgotten amongst all of this is that within the concept of terrorism within this country, it's a very bold and rather simplistic view of what constitutes terrorism. Essentially, it's the use of force for a political, religious, or ideological cause. Now, of course, any struggle of any description that is not entirely pacifist struggle involves force. So the question is, whose force and in what context? The definition in this country essentially assigns the state the right to say who is entitled to use force, and basically means any other state, essentially. So any state, non-state actor, or any group that should or has aspirations to be a state, is disempowered from using any form of force. Now, in the Belgian decision, it took the correct, perhaps more international law position of saying, well, hold on, under UN and international law, there is a right to self-defense, and a right to self-defense isn't just in relation to states, it's in relation to sub-state actors as well. If they commit war crimes, of course they are, and as they should be, liable for that. Attacks on civilians, all those sorts of things. They are crimes. They're internationally prohibited agreement. You don't need to describe a group as a terrorist organisation. Now, as it turns out, there's no suggestion the PKK are even doing that. But I remember talking to the Belgian lawyer involved and having the pleasure of listening to him talk about the case, and he was saying what one of the things that was so interesting was, every time the prosecution would produce weapons that maybe the PKK in the mountains had been used to defend themselves, they'll say, exactly, that's our point. We're entitled to self-defense. It's not the fact that whether you are armed, it's what you do about it. And that's the correct position in international law. And the debate of terrorism has unfortunately muddied all of that, because the definition, certainly in this country, is so narrow. It's impossible to imagine anyone who wishes to liberate themselves anywhere in the world of not being described as a terrorist. And the Belgian court have got rid of that. They got rid of that fog, and allowed things to be seen much clearer. And
what implications, if any, do you think that the Belgium court case might have for the potential decriminalisation of the PK elsewhere, perhaps in Europe and the UK and the US?
Well, it's obviously wonderful that a modern state has recognised what should have frankly been self-evident, and that will undoubtedly give confidence to whether it's other courts or other states to say, it was a very hard-fought and well-argued decision. It wasn't a small court, not apprised of all the facts, it was appealed on, as far as I'm aware, on 2 or 3 occasions within Belgium. So it is undoubtedly an important decision. And as I say, I think it correctly locates what the law should be on all of this. So it should give confidence to other courts or activists in other countries. And now, ultimately, it depends on the law of each country as to what extent they prescribe organisations or not. But in the circumstances that we're in at the moment, there's no reason why it can't be used to assist in challenges with deconscription globally.
Okay, and then just finally, lastly, 2 just questions to summarise. So, in your view, Alastair, what would it mean for the Kurdish issue if the UK did remove the PKK from the list of proscribed organisations?
Well, it's the only proper thing that should be done from a legal, political, moral principles. But obviously, practically, it would allow the Kurdish community to have an honest discussion politically and to express themselves in the way that they wish. It would clearly have a international resonance as well, in that there would be a recognition that actually, as an organisation, it is not, even on the very narrow definition in this country, it does not fit it. And then in the broader way, it will help reshape the arguments, because the problem is that the moment you will use the word terrorism to describe an organisation or a community, you stop people thinking. You stop a debate and you stop the ability to achieve peace, because essentially you've labelled one side of the argument as being in the wrong, and not just in the wrong, you've insulted it. And it's difficult to know that how could ever be a basis for a discussion which will allow a viable peace process.
So, yeah, this labeling of this word terrorism does exactly as you say, and the criminalization of the Kurdish movement historically has been the single biggest block to finding a peaceful political solution to the Kurdish question. What, in your view, Alastair, needs to happen for the UK to decriminalize the PKK, thereby creating an avenue for the Kurdish movement to be able to open up avenues for political dialogue with the Turkish state to achieve a lasting and peaceful settlement?
Well, I mean, there are two routes. Given that prescription itself is essentially a political choice, deprescription is equally a political choice, and it is it's a political struggle, perhaps quite a large one, given the country we have at the moment and the government we have at the moment. But to persuade them that it's entirely counterproductive, and that it's so that's one aspect to it. The second question is whether alongside that there is a legal approach. It is a very difficult legal challenge. It's not an impossible one, but it's a difficult one because of the way the law is framed. Ultimately, it's up to the Home Secretary to describe who to prescribe or not. And the challenge is limited. It's there, but it's limited. But as I say, in general terms, there's the political, if the Home Secretary wanted to deprescribe, it could be done tomorrow.
Alastair Lyon from Bernburg Pierce, thank you so much for joining us today to talk about this issue.